Hello, everyone. My name is Mor Odawa, and welcome to the final episode of African History Month. As you all know, African History Month is an annual event to celebrate the achievements of people of African descent and acknowledge African enormous contributions to the world's civilization. So, of course, to start us off will be the opening remarks. And it is, of course, with great pleasure I introduce to you the founder of the African History Month, who is also the President of the United States of Africa, Mr. Daniel Momboli. Mr. Daniel Mombolu's video will soon play, sorry for the delay, with his opening remarks. As we get ready for that, remember today we have our great panelists. Our panel discussion topic is on the Western military interventions in Africa and the Sahel region. I don't know if our president's video is ready. Okay, I think the producer is not ready with our video. Sincere apologies for that. So let's go right. I'll give 1 minute to our panelists who are already with us for introduction, Mr. Gerald.
The final episode of the African History Month. And the African History Month is an annual event to celebrate the people of Africa and provide a platform to celebrate and acknowledge Africa, enormous contribution that Africa has made throughout centuries. The African History Month is an opportunity for people of African descent to come together and realize that our strength lies in our unity with ongoing global crisis. Africans need to learn from the West and also unify. We need as a unified force whenever our interests are threatened. This is the kind of approach that is going to make every action successful. It's the kind of mentality that will make Africans in charge of their own destiny. Today, as we talk about Western foreign militarization in Africa and its impact on Africa's security, it's very clear that these so-called foreign interventions have in no way contributed towards providing security for Africans. They've never been able to solve the so-called terrorism challenges they can put against. And instead, we are seeing the rise of more extremist groups, and surprisingly, these are some countries that are having these separate groups and then so that they can destroy even Africa's oldest nation. It's clear that the West does not have any interest of Africa at heart. Therefore, we as Africans have to unify, embrace the spirit of Pan-Africanism, and begin to utilize unity to solve real-time problems that Africa is facing. We are heavily dependent on the West and the East, and if there's any crisis, then it affects us directly. Africa is blessed with enormous natural resources, and we should be the last continent to be depending on others for survival. And in fact, the West has been depending on Africa for centuries for its survival. It's actually ridiculous for them to claim that now they want to be self-reliant. Yet their success, their prosperity comes from exploitation and descent during slavery, during colonization. They still holding thousands of stolen African artifacts, and these are some nations that are talking about democracy in Africa. They're talking about human rights in Africa. That when it comes to the issue of the suffering of people of African descent around the world, they don't care less. They're more interested in fighting for people that look like them. United States of Africa has been advocating for the end of genocide in West Papua for more than 2 years, and we haven't seen these Western nations respond to the cries and the lamentations of the indigenous people. West Papua, the catastrophe in the Pacific region, the natural resources that that you don't know West exploiting these natural resources at the expense of the indigenous Black people, and this is what we've been fighting against, making sure that Black people are given equal rights and dignity to determine their destiny. They need to be granted freedom to decide their destiny, whether they want to be an independent nation or remain part of Indonesia. The so-called act of free choice did not even take into consideration that West Papua had 800,000 people then. Only 1,026 people were the rest, and as a result, West Papua was handed over to was actually grabbed in Asia. This day it remains a colony. As we talk about imperialism, colonialism, we are talking about the need for Africans to support West independence, the same way Africans support the support African country. That's the same needs in order for Africa to develop, there is need for us to change our mindset and begin so in terms of the natural resources. We have talented young people that can innovate and bring so many ideas into reality if they are supported. And this is why the United States of Africa Technology and Innovation Department has been working with dozens of volunteers in order to create African-centered solutions. And by doing this, through voluntarism spirit, we are encouraging Africans to be.
Welcome back. Sorry about our connection. That is the founder of African History Month, Mr. Daniel Mambono, who was giving us our opening remarks. Sincere apologies for our connections. The producer is working on our video. If you are just joining us, welcome to our live streaming. Remember, African History Month is an annual event where we celebrate the achievements of the people of the African descent and, of course, their contributions towards the world's civilization. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our panelists for introduction. We would love to get to know you, your names, what you do briefly, 1 minute of introduction. Thank you very much. I'd like to start off with Mr. Gerald.
Greetings, everybody. I'm Gerald Pereira. I'm a political activist, been active for over 50-something years. I'm a Pan-Africanist. In terms of academic training, I did political science, transpersonal psychology, education, and culminated my studies with doctorates in systematic theology, focus on liberation theology. I resided in Libya for a number of years, where I taught at the Green World Institute. And I met a lot of African freedom fighters and so who were coming then to the Great Libyan Jamahiriya for ideological training. So I'm in Guyana. I'm the chairperson of the Organization for the Victory of the People, a Guyanese revolutionary socialist formation, fighting for just society and making our contribution for a better world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerald. I would proceed to Dr. Asmat.
Greetings, everyone. So I'm Hamzat Boukari Yabara from Benin, West Africa, and my mother is from Martinique, French Caribbean. I'm currently the head of the Pan-African League Umoja, which is a political international organization based in several African countries and also in African diaspora. So we are trying to organize political parties and to reintroduce Pan-Africanism on the political plan. I'm also a writer. I wrote several books, including a biography of Walter Rodney from Guyana, who is one of my main references, and also a strong book about Pan-Africanism in French, because I'm part of this so-called French-speaking world. And I'm also a political activist, and I thank you for the opportunity to discuss foreign Western intervention in Africa.
Thank you very much. And finally, we have Mr. Ibrahimo CE. Carry on. I'm sorry, Mr. Ibrahimo. I think your mic is muted. We cannot hear you.
Activism. My academic training is law by as a profession, but currently I worked as a humanitarian in a organization, interested in the liberation of the whole of the African continent and all the peoples of African descent at home and abroad. And I can say my upbringing was inspired by religious education. But later on, as I got introduced to Chancellor Williams and then the world, the people of African descent that have been standing for the liberation of the continent, we drastically changed to become these, young extremist Pan-Africanists that will not apologize for speaking and then the liberation of the people of African descent at home and abroad. And I'm glad to be here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, our able panelists, for your introduction. Looking forward to having a great discussion with you all. Right about now, without further ado, let's get right to our topic. I believe we all know our topic, where it is Western military interventions in Africa and the Sahel region. And of course, aside from that, we'll also briefly touch about the NATO expansion and the new age of imperialism. So the first question that I would ask, and of course declare the floor open for discussion, would be in regards to war on terror in Africa by AFRICOM and NATO allied forces. How has these interventions impacted on African security?
Hey, could anyone go ahead?
Oh, you can go. You can start.
Let Gerald go first. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
If you look at, well, the last brother mentioned Chancellor Williams' name. So we're going to draw the line between invasions, and we're going to look at what happened in Africa post-colonial after what we could rightfully describe as flag and anthem independence. The fallacious independence that Kwame Nkrumah, after he was overthrown, and he was sitting in Guinea-Conakry when he wrote the book on neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. The Western nations intervene in Africa primarily because we know that Africa is the richest, the wealthiest continent on the planet in terms of its resources. For Europe to survive, for Europe and North America to survive, they must have access to the vast resources of Africa. And over the years, for decades, what the Western powers have been doing is if they've intervened in Africa either through direct military intervention or they have done it indirectly. Directly, we have cases where the last one where NATO, which can be rightfully described as a criminal entity, went beyond its jurisdiction and invaded an African country, the Libyan Jamahiriya, and destroyed it. The entire basis of that intervention was based on a mask and a big lie. Nothing new. That is an example of direct military intervention. Then we had direct military intervention where they removed Laurent Gbagbo in Côte d'Ivoire in Ivory Coast. the French were providing military assistance to Ouattara, who was a former World Bank official, and imposed a fraudulent and neo-colonial regime in Ivory Coast. Then we have the latest example of an indirect intervention is where the Western forces, the United States, Britain, and France, and Belgium, were actually aiding and abetting, providing intelligence and other forms of assistance to the Tigray People's Liberation Front to break up Ethiopia. So those are examples. I give the direct intervention and indirect, but it's all about restructuring and redividing Africa in this period, because we are saying that the West wants to maintain the Western powers that we can rightfully define from a historical perspective as the Anglo-Saxon nations or the North Atlantic Tribes Organization, NATO, are bullying the world. They want to maintain their hegemony, global hegemony. And right now they're using NATO as an instrument to expand and expand further. They've reached the point now where they use Ukraine. They were using Ukraine to encircle Russia, and we have what we're witnessing today. So getting back to Africa, is Western military intervention has always been to get control of African resources, and they do that through either imposing or propping up neo-colonial regimes like the ones you have, and I make no apologies for it, the neo-colonial regimes in Rwanda, in Uganda, and we have neo-colonial regimes in Kenya. These are regimes that facilitate imperialism in Africa. Or what they can do is they support heretical Islamic groups like Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, ISIS, and all of those groups in the Sahel, Boko Haram, and all of these groups to undermine and create instability in Africa. And they know that Africa is weak militarily and economically to deal with these bogus jihadists, these heretical thugs. So what they do is turn to the African leaders, to the neo-colonial leaders, and said, look, we will deal with this for you. So they go about by setting up military bases on the Africa. Right? Look what happened in Mali. The Malian military realized that the French were not really serious about flushing out these Islamic heretical groups. So the Malian military turned to Russia for assistance. Why? Because they've seen what Russia has been doing on the battlefield. Had it not been for Russian intervention in Syria, Syria would have collapsed, Iraq would have collapsed, and Lebanon would have collapsed, and the black flag of the ISIS group would have been flying. Now, I am not here to bat for any country, but if you understand Mao Zedong, we have to be able to understand how do we handle contradictions and to know our friends and who are our enemies. And the worst thing we can do as Pan-Africanists is to allow our enemies or the enemies for our enemies to make us enemies of their enemies. Because as Mandela said, we will end up with no friends. So we have to understand what is happening here. So the Malian military sought the assistance of Russia in the fight against these groups, and I think they're achieving success, because when you look at the weaponry and the fleet of Toyota pickups and motorcycles and all of this expensive means of transportation that these groups have, where is the funding coming from? And I will tell you plain up, because I wrote very early on what happened in Libya. It is there, right? The money for these groups are coming with the full knowledge of the United States, with the CIA, Western intelligence services, Qatar, little Qatar that is very ambitious, and even the Turks are playing their games in Africa. So we have all these outside forces who are competing with each other to control Africa, and we have to be careful.
Okay, very valid points there. Dr. Amzad, what do you think about the impact that these allied forces have on the African security?
Yeah, thank you. I'm absolutely agree with Brother Gerald. I think that this situation is part of the recolonization of Africa.
Yeah.
And we need to remind that NATO was created to fight communism, and foreign intervention in Africa were based on fighting communism in Africa. But it was not fighting communism. It was safeguarding Western interest in Africa. So we also have to understand that what was created with 9/11 was the making of a threat, a global threat, that is a war on terror, to invest, military speaking, Africa. Because when you see how the Western and especially US AFRICOM moved in Africa with the flintlock exercises and all the military training, it started at a time where there was no terrorism in the Sahel. The first training started at the time where there were no threats in the Sahel. So in a way, the foreign military Western intervention introduced the threat inside Africa to justify the militarization of Africa. That is part of a recolonization of Africa. Because one question after the fall of the Soviet Union is how long could NATO have survived to the fall of the Soviet Union without another target? And this target was called Islamism, but it was just a mobile. It was not the real target. Islamism was created, was introduced to create ISIS, to create Boko Haram, to create Shabab in Somalia, so the piracy, and so on. And this fight against Islamism and terrorism led some countries like Mali, like the Central African Republic, like Mozambique, like Sudan, to start new partnerships with Russia. And now we have Russia in Africa, back in Africa. So we are coming to a new kind of a Cold War, a new Cold War that is part of the new age of imperialism. And this global war is based on African resources, because behind Russia, you have China. So you have to remind that in the 70s and the 80s, there was a clash between China and the Soviet. And this clash was used by the foreign Western powers to take control of some part of Africa. So I think that today we have a different kind of military intervention in Africa, because those military interventions are based on the training of African armies, on the training of African leaders, like Gerald say, you know the case in Uganda, in Rwanda, and so on. And you also have wars of destabilization. And this is a change with the former times, because we used to know wars of liberation in Africa. But now we have wars of recolonization in Africa and wars of division, of balkanization of Africa. So if we take the case of Mali, we know that after Mali got independence from France in 1960, in the time of the Algerian War, there was already a division between Tuareg and Arab groups in the north and the population in the south. And this division was used by the French to try to get a position in the Sahara and in the Sahel. And when the war started in 2012, the region that is called Azawad was at the center of global interest. It was the idea of balkanizing Mali, to take control of natural resources in the north, and you can only do it with a military presence in the north. that is the cause of the French intervention in Mali. You have also the case in Central African Republic, which was a basement for the French military system for uranium. And when the war started, it was a so-called ethnic war, a question between Muslim and so on. So this kind of justification are also used to be part of a recolonization, a new Balkanization of Africa. But what is really interesting today is that we have new African resistance, because the youth and the Pan-Africanists are getting more and more power and conscious of this situation. And what is really interesting at the global level is that Pan-Africanism is probably the only political system that could challenge NATO, especially in the Atlantic world, because Pan-Africanism is about Africa, Europe, and the Americas and the Caribbean. So it is the only ideological and political and historical system that can challenge the Western domination in the Atlantic system. So they are really afraid of a Pan-African renewal, of a Pan-African rebirth, and this is what we need to understand. They are also fighting Pan-Africanism when they say they are fighting terrorism, Islamism, and so on. And now you have a criminalization of Pan-African activists in many African countries today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amzat. You mentioned something a bit critical. You mentioned foreign military intervention. And that brings me to a question, and I'll direct it, of course, to you, Mr. CE. What do you think are the impacts of foreign military interventions in Africa? I'm sorry.
Like, to answer that question, as young as I am today, and post-independent days, I was not even born yet. But thanks to the people that lived before us in the post-independent days in order to keep these records for us. You know, when one looked at Maputo, for instance, in DRC, the best friend of Maputo, they lived in Washington, D.C., or Bush at the time. So one can say that the foreign military bases in Africa are first and foremost there to protect the regimes that are there to oppress their own people in order to serve the foreign powers. The foreign powers, I mean, their slave masters. The foreign power military bases are not here to protect any African country. There's no African country that can tell you, either Djibouti or country, like for instance in the Horn of Africa, it's the most destabilized region of Africa. I've been to Eastern Africa and then to Northern Africa, Sudan, for instance, Somalia. Who can say those places are secured? And you have more foreign military bases in those countries than the actual domestic military in those countries. So you can say they're not there to protect the people. They're there to protect, number one, the people, the regimes that made them come there first. And then the second thing is to make sure that each and every African country try to copy what Lumumba, Sankara were doing at the time. Is to make sure that anybody that is to come after the likes of Thomas Sankara, the likes of Lumumba, you are taken down by the military bases that lives 5 minutes away from you. For instance, today when we have EFF government in South Africa, like you don't have to go all the way to USA to South Africa in order to destabilize South Africa to take the regime down. You just have to fly from Lesotho to Johannesburg. So it's to make sure that they're close to us. But as the professor, like Amzat mentioned, that it is time now everybody understood in the continent that the only ideology and then the only people that can put the Pan-Africans, and the only ideology that can do it is Pan-Africanism. when one looks at these military bases that are in Africa, you don't have to go far. I always tell my colleagues at the school that why are you not reading about what Nkrumah wrote about this? Nkrumah was heartbroken and then he was sitting in Conakry, but he never met people like me, and then we were not even born when Nkrumah was dying. But the facts he put in those books were meant for us. And if we never read about what Nkrumah was writing, we can't understand what is going on right now. And another
Absolutely.
thing is, if Walter Rodney was assassinated just by writing a book, I think
Mhm.
it is by force, and it must be by force upon each and every young African to read that book. That was the reason why his life was taken, and that is going to be the first step for us to move close to this liberation.
Okay. Thank you very much. You mentioned something, sorry, uh, that basically this foreign militarization in Africa, they are not here to protect the people, but the regime. Yeah.
Yes.
And now that brings me to a question where I'm thinking, do you think there's great effect of this militarization in Africa on human rights? You know, like directly or indirectly on our human rights, because basically they're not here to protect us, they're here to protect the regime that's there. Do you think it affects the human rights?
Of course, it's not a rocket science to see that. Look at Libya. You don't have to go anywhere else. Just look at Libya. Whatever Libya is going through today is as
Okay.
a result of foreign military intervention in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
You have more people dying between 2011 and 2022 in Libya than the entire 40 years ruling of Gaddafi.
Yeah.
Now that you don't, nobody is going to ask a question to explain that. Number two, you have to look at Equatorial Guinea, for instance. People
Mm-hmm.
don't we want them to we can't do anything about it because there are forces that are protecting these regimes that are violating the rights of their own people. So
Mm-hmm.
NATO is not interested, as I used to say, France or Great Britain or all the imperial nations are never interested in the human rights of the African people. Whenever human rights is talked about, it's about all the people, because either you know it militarily, economically, even healthcare wise, we have been taking down all these directions. Like for instance, in my country, there was no saying that let us test the COVID vaccines before we injected them to the bodies of our own people.
Yeah.
It's from
I think
Europe, then it can be done like that. Because there are people sitting in those offices of ours that's supposed to be asking those questions. Why not we do a domestic test for our own people? So that's one side of the story. But the human rights violations are the peak of these things because Europeans or the conceptual Europe can never have in Africa what they wish to have without violating the rights of the African people.
Uh-huh. Wow. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Gerald. Do you have anything to add on that?
Uh, the brother mentioned Mobutu. Now, what I would like to say is this: getting
Mm-hmm.
back to what brother Ibrahim was talking about, and let me go early back to brother Hamzat.
Yeah.
It, across the continent, there is no African leader who would say to you that he's not a Pan-Africanist. Every African leader refer to
Uh-huh.
themselves as Pan-Africanists. But then
Yeah.
let's judge them. Mobutu was supposed to be a Pan-Africanist, and so was Jonas Savimbi of UNITA in Angola. But they were being
Mm-hmm.
supported by apartheid South Africa and the CIA. And today, if you recall, when when they got rid of Mobutu and Laurent Kabila took power with the assistance of his military, he got assistance from Uganda and Rwanda. And then he turned to the two presidents. He turned to Paul Kagame and Museveni and said, well, it's time for your forces to leave. And they refused, because you know what they were doing? The military top brass were mining, carrying out illegal mining in the areas, and they did not want to move on. It was crystal clear. And the next thing you know is Kabila was talking about something different. Kabila was talking about the construction of a new system, something similar to what the Libyans had, that would involve people in popular assemblies to make decisions. Because you only have to look at the last president's speech he gave. And they got rid of him. He was killed. They got rid of him. And you still have Museveni and the others parading. And you would recall that when the battle started, it became a battle of the lakes. You actually had Angola, Zimbabwe, and I think Mozambique sent in troops to help Kabila to fight Uganda and Rwanda. We had this battle going on. That was a war being waged, and it was being waged to flush out, and we still have them in our midst. So when we are talking about Pan-Africanism, we have to be clear. First of all, we have a lot of fake Pan-Africanists in our midst. And that's why we have to always emphasize the concept of revolutionary Pan-Africanism. I do not see, like Kwame Ture, I do not see Pan-Africanism as such as an ideology. I see it as an objective that we are struggling for, right? But what guides us ideologically and philosophically should be the principles of scientific socialism. Because we cannot build Pan-Africanism or a Pan-African unity based on neoliberal capitalism. No race of people have suffered more. And it was our enslavement, the wars that were made in us, captured and then enslaved for hundreds of years, as Walter Rodney pointed out in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and the great Trinidadian historian, Dr. Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, that it was the trade, the so-called trade, or the African Holocaust that laid the material and economic foundation for capitalism to spring off. Had it not been that, there would have been no capitalist development. And that's why the Eastern Bloc countries lagged behind the West, because they didn't have access to the free labor, the free wealth of the Americas, and they were not participants in the trade and the captured trade of enslaved Africans. They were not. So, and when we talk about scientific socialism, we have to be, I want to be clear, because the orthodox, the Marxists, the Marxists like to speak of Marxism and scientific socialism as the same. No, they're not the same. Now, no one can deny that Marx did not make a contribution, observe certain truths, right? But we have to realize at the end of the day that Marx was looking at the world from a European perspective. And as Sekou Touré says, people's ideologies must emerge out of their culture. And scientific socialism is a law, a general, it's a universal law that is observable, that every human being, the same way we can observe the laws of gravity, but that we don't say, well, because Newton observed it or he's recorded it. There were Africans in Kemet who observed that thousands of years before Newton, you know? So we don't say, well, the laws of gravity, as the Europeans like to do, associated with Newton, when Africans observed that principle and understood it thousands of years before Newton. And it's the same thing with scientific socialism. Marx might have observed something, but scientific socialism and Marxism, not the same. I think Cabral understood this. Nkrumah understood it when he wrote Consciencism. And I think Sekou Touré did. So our Pan-Africanism, we have to emphasize the concept of revolutionary Pan-Africanism. And we have a lot of homework and house cleaning to do. We have to weed out the Pan-African, the fake Pan-Africanists in our midst, because there are a lot of fake Pan-African organizations that are being set up. And when you go and check the source of the funding, it's coming from George Soros Foundation, the National Endowment for Democracy, and right-wing center-right think tanks in Germany, like the Adnio Foundation and those groups. If you go and do your research, you'll see these groups are pushing. They're pushing in Africa. These NGOs, they're real Trojan horses of neocolonialism, or as the brother will say, recolonization, and they're being funded. So look at the thousands of NGOs we have in Africa, and in Nkrumah address that, and some of the so-called apolitical entities, like the role of the JCs, the Lions, and all of these organizations that like to tell you they're apolitical, but definitely when you look at the position they take and the class alignment, you see where it leads to.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Of course, if you're just joining us, remember our topic today is Western military interventions in Africa and the Sahel region. Other than that, we'll of course touch briefly on the NATO expansion and the new age of imperialism. So this brings me to a question in regards to the Russia-Ukraine war globally, yeah? What do you think are some of the after effects of this war? And how do you think we'll actually bounce back from all of it as Africa? The after effects of this Russia-Ukraine war, and how as Africa we can actually bounce back. Maybe we can start with the after effects. Dr. Mzat?
Yes, sorry, I would like to say a few words about what has been said before, because I think that we forgot one point. When you ask about the effect of militarization on human rights, I think we need to remind that for the Western world, we are not Black people, we are not human. This is the beginning of the colonization. We are not human beings. And this was proved by slavery, by colonialism, by apartheid, segregation, neo-colonialism, and neo-slavery. So we are not considered as human beings. So they can kill us. Nobody cares. And this is really important, because racism is the other half of capitalism. Like Gerald say, the system is capitalism, but it works with racism. And racism is built to make us nothing, so that we are the targets that don't count in this war. Another point is that we need to understand how our enemies works. It starts with soft power and it ends with hard power. Soft power is about foreign Western intervention in Africa, saying that there are human rights violations in Africa. So because they are violating human rights in Africa, we are making a military intervention in Africa. So this is the first start of soft power, and it is built by a Western neoliberal think tank and media. And they are starting with this point. Next point is the International Criminal Court, because they need to get a juridical case to prove, to justify their intervention. And next step is the UN Security Council. And the next step after the International Criminal Court and the UN Security Council is NATO. And NATO is hard power. NATO is strength. NATO is here to erase everything, to put Libya to the edge stone. So you have a gradation from soft to hard power. And this is how they kill first your reputation, saying that you are a terrorist, saying that you are an anti-white people, that you don't like white people, etc., etc. They did it with Lumumba. They say he was a communist, he was a devil, etc., and then they killed him. They did it. They tried to do it with Sankara. They also tried to do it with every African leaders that was not aligned with their vision. So they kill your reputation before they kill you. So we need to understand how the enemy works, because it is really important to understand it. Another point, I think, is that we have to to put forward African achievements. We are at the African History Month. We need to study how the Ethiopians fought the Italians at Adwa War. We need to study African military victories in our history. It is really important because it is with African achievements in military history that we can build our own revolutionary Pan-Africanism. We have an experiences of armed struggle, armed liberation struggle all over Africa. So all those experiences, we need to mobilize them and to understand that we are truly in a new era of global imperialism. So we need to define a new Pan-African strategy. And this new Pan-African strategy must understand the geopolitics, must understand the place of Africa in the global world. Why NATO is in Africa? It is because Africa is central in the global system. So we need to understand it. And it is not only about the Atlantic world, it is also about the Indian Ocean. And that is why the case of Russia and Ukraine is also central, because behind Russia, it is about China. And it is about the One Belt, One Road project of China, because China is making a new map of the world, even in the Caribbean, even in South America. And Russia is the military power that is working today with Russia as an economic power. So I will let my colleagues start with the question about Russia and Ukraine, but I think it was really important to introduce the notion of racism in the case of Western foreign military intervention, because these are racist interventions.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. That was very, very precise and clear. So, Mr. CC, what do you think are some of the after effects of this Russia-Ukraine war in Africa? And do you actually think we will be able to bounce back?
To mention, like, from the Afro-optimistic viewpoint of it, first of all, I would say to some of us that have been crying and then looking forward to ways how to break the system that is keeping us in the cages and then bondages of slavery and then mental colonialization that is going on. First of all, we as young Pan-Africans understood that what Russia proved to the world stage today, to all of us, that yes, you can go against the global system in order to protect the interest and the integrity of your own people and your history, and then nothing can come out of it. That is one thing we learned from it. And in terms of what most of the Afro-pessimists will say, that we're going to face the economic deprivation and also the food supply chain of the world. Yes, it's good for us that some of us will start thinking about what about we grow the food that we need instead of relying on what is coming from Ukraine and Russia. And the other point we will learn from this aftermath of this Ukraine-Russia crisis is that no matter how bad they might stain some of our leaders like they did to Gaddafi, that all of us, our countries remain silent, that only young people and activists were speaking in the defense of Gaddafi and the people of Libya. But even my own country, my government, spoke ill of Gaddafi just because of the Western propaganda. So today we look at Putin all the way around. We say, what about if we're not anywhere supporting Russia in the invasion of Ukraine, to say we understood the right of the Ukrainian people, but we're trying to also understand the mindset of the Putin. What about if Putin's grandfather was killed in the Nazi invasion of Russia? What if Putin is one of those sons and that generation that was looking at the humiliation that their people went in their relationship with Russia, with NATO, and all the conceptual West? But what also if Ukraine continued to be what they were doing and then end up becoming a member country of NATO? What if they launch an attack on Russia? That will be the collapse of the Russian people, the collapse of the entire history the Russian people have built for themselves for centuries and centuries and centuries. So in this case of Ukraine, we also learned from it. Whenever the world stood, we said democracy, the fight of the people, the right of the sovereignty of the countries should not be speak because still the lesser people, because we could not even be allowed to leave Ukraine as all the people were living. So there's no way that all the whole world can see one thing A and Africa to see it A. Africa must always look at it. What is in this as the people of Africa? Because it's always, and I always refer to these two books because they guided me to my entire life, is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and the Destruction of Black Civilization. And in these two books, I understood I should not speak, nor should I like or hate like the rest of the people, because I'm not like the rest of the people. I am an African who is hated because of the blessings that are in my continent, because of what is in me, what God bless the people that look like me. Either they live within the continent or without the continent. This is why I no longer see things the way most of the people will see them.
Wow. Mr. Gerald, you are a political activist as well. Do you think we would be able to bounce back as Africa for us to be?
Yeah, well, I don't believe the world is going to be the same. The world is going to change tremendously. And I only today I saw a piece where President Putin said that Russia is going to, you'll have to buy Russian gas, oil, and other products by using the ruble, and they will measure it against the gold bullion. I think the Western, I think we're going to see the end of the petrodollar that came about at the time of the so-called oil crisis in the 70s. And China is very aware. The Chinese are aware that this encirclement of Russia is not just about Russia alone. It's the complete after the encirclement of Russia is for China too. And we have to live in the world of don't live in our heads. We live in a world that we have a global bully, and that's the United States. The United States, look at what they did. They invaded small Grenada. How could small Grenada have been a security threat to the United States? They went into Panama, bombed the hell out of Panama, and killed thousands of African Panamanians. And this is what they've been doing. And as my brother Amzad said, they don't see us as humans. Because when you take, for example, the United States, and I'm getting right back to this thing about Ukraine. And so when you look at the United States, all the so-called founding fathers of the United States, when they wrote the beautiful words of the Constitution, right, and spoke about the inalienable rights of men, they were speaking about white men, not black men and indigenous people, because all of them were slaveholders, right? You look at the philosophers of the so-called European Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, and you will see that they all made, in one way or the other, justified or argued for slavery, right? They did not see the African as a human. He was subhuman. So you had no problem with enslaving him since he hadn't the soul. Good? And it was the same thing with the U.S. Civil War. The Civil War was not over whether Africans should be enslaved or not. No, go and read the Jefferson-Lincoln debates and you will see Lincoln believed that white people were superior. So those are things we have to get. Now when we get back here, I'm saying this war in Ukraine was set up by the West. Ukraine was being used for many reasons. But what has happened now with the sanctions is that the sanctions are backfiring, because even you can see cracks in the Western, in the NATO alliance. Even Turkey is pushing their own agenda. I think what we are going to see is the emergence of eventually two trading blocs competing. And one way or the other, the smaller ones will be forced to take a position. Like in the Caribbean, Caribbean nations, the small Caribbean states took positions that I definitely was not happy with. We should have done like the African countries, just abstain. And I salute all those African countries that abstain and those who refuse to vote. And I give a special salute to Eritrea for the position they took, because it's one of the countries that they cannot put and base an African base in. Even Algeria, I was really shocked at Algeria, but then this is where a lot of the liberation movements start off. We were fighting colonialism, and then we end up becoming neo-colonial regimes. Good, like what you see, we've seen it, because I've seen a comment with somebody say, well, the fake Pan-Africanists. Well, you know, the ANC, white monopoly capital, is still in power. The ANC has never been a Pan-African organization. That was the work of the Pan-African Congress under Robert Sobukwe. But yet the world knew more about Mandela than Robert Sobukwe. Or even in my sister's country, you know, we know more about Jomo Kenyatta than Dedan Kimathi, and Dedan Kimathi was the real burning spear of the liberation struggle. So when we look, because in delivering a revolutionary Pan-African perspective, I say that for us, we have a big bully in any country in the United States backyard, that in the so-called backyard, that refuse to go along with their line neoliberal economic policies or take direction from them. They either isolate you, block you, sanction you, and that is what they do. And believe me, the US policy towards Cuba, the blockade of Cuba, has nothing to do with communism. It's because Cuba is fiercely nationalist. Anything in the so-called backyard must surrender to them. Because they had a war in Vietnam, lost thousands, hundreds of thousands, but yet they do business with Vietnam. You didn't sanction Vietnam. So they don't sanction the blockade against Cuba. Is not because of ideology. It's about Cuba's stance of to be sovereign, to be independent, not bowing to the global hegemon. And what I'm seeing is this, I see in the contradictions here. And when I look at it with what is happening, I'm saying here, we are seeing how the West is aiding and abetting neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, many like the Azov battalion and the far-right nationalists, they actually see the Russian people as Slavic. That's where the term slave came from, really. So they see the Yugoslavs and the Russians as not the Aryan, that they're subhuman. Good.
Mr.
And
Gerald,
many of those,
allow me to cut you short a bit. I'd like to engage Mr. Abzat in what you just said. You said there were cracks in NATO, yeah? And I'd like to bring up a question to build up that part of your conversation with, of course, Dr. Amzat. Do you think NATO acted in a manner that seemed like they're in support of Ukraine in the war? Dr. Amzat.
I think I miss the point. Do you think that NATO is
acted in a manner that seemed to be in support of Ukraine in the war? Because you see, Mr. Gerald highlighted that there were some cracks in the NATO. And I bring up this question, that do you think NATO acted in a manner that it was in support of Ukraine in the war?
I think NATO is a global project. It is starting off the global control of global resources by the West. And the case of Ukraine is really interesting, because Ukraine was part and is part of the Soviet world, the Eastern and Russian civilization. Like Gerald said, we are speaking of Slavic people. It's brothers and sisters are fighting against one another, like we see it in Africa. So we have those kind of fighting even in Africa. So we know how imperialism works. The main difference is that Russia is not an African country. It is a military power that has also the most developed weapons today. So it is not a small power. And Putin is the oldest leader in the global north in powers today. So he had a long experience. He knows how the West is working, and I think that NATO used Ukraine for sure. Promised to Ukraine that they would be given help. And also one point is that between NATO and Russia and Ukraine, you have the European Union. And actually, currently, the European Union is led by the French President Emmanuel Macron, who is also in rivalry with Putin in Africa. And I think it is not, it is really interesting to connect all these points. So we have a kind of different levels imbricated in one another with NATO as the global, the final point, like in the war in Libya. We know that the war in Libya, it was said that it was about Nicolas Sarkozy and Cameron, so Paris and London, who decided to fight Gaddafi, but we know in real that it was the US with NATO who decided to overthrow Gaddafi. So I think NATO triggered off this war, knew that Putin would answer, and it is also a way to move out of the statu quo that is here since the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think that we are in a new redefinition of global alliance. And what is also really interesting is the way Africa is at the center of the rivalry, of the global rivalry. Because when President Macron visited Putin in the Kremlin, they also spoke of the Russian presence in Mali. So we are in a very interesting redefinition of the different actors of the new imperialism. And I think that we also should analyze as Africans, as Pan-African, how Ukraine dealt with Russia. Because in a sense, Ukraine was part of the Soviet system, like Ivory Coast is still part of the French neocolonial system. So even in solidarity with Russia against Western imperialism, we also should look at the way a country that was part of the imperialist system of the Soviet Union tried to move out of the clutches of Russia, but could not do it unless it engaged with another imperialist system. So this is really interesting because Ukraine, to move out of the Soviet influence, the Russian influence, had to look at the Western. So I think this situation is really interesting to analyze for us Africans. We're thinking that we are moving out the Western domination by joining the Russian. And I think that we have to find a third way, our own way, and this way is absolutely a Pan-African way. And in this situation, the African vote at the United Nations, condemning or not Russian intervention, is really interesting because we saw a new division of African countries at the geopolitical level. And we need to find a single and united African voice at the geopolitical level. And this is what we need to build today. And this voice should be effectively revolutionary, but also strategically organized. I think that we need to take position, but we also need to build our own position and to see if the other are joining our position. So it is not about supporting Russia or Ukraine, but it is about who is supporting African position on Russia and Ukraine. This is absolutely central if we want to get a Pan-African position in the case of this new imperialism.
Wow, thank you very much for that. I believe we all know part of Ukraine was seized. Yeah? Do you think Russia has any economic gain by seizing part of Ukraine? Mr. Ibrahim, if you could speak on that. I'm sorry, we cannot hear you.
Okay, I was saying I don't think it's like on economic basis only for Russia. Like for Russia, there's more to this than the economy. Like for instance, the Crimea, like that part to be part of Russia is about like the Golan Height of Lebanon when with regards to Israel. To Russia, it's not security. It's about also the people. Russia had Vladimir Putin also personally thinks these are people that must be protected by him. These are the Russian origins that are living in those territories, and there's more of historical connection like to the Russians, the leadership in Kremlin today. Yes. More to that, I can say what Kuruma said before, as Dr. Amzad was saying, that we must not be with Russia nor with West. Yes, Kuruma mentioned that Africa's solution should not be with West. We're not either not West with West nor with East. Africa must be where Africa is supposed to be. To understand that we are at our own, like nobody is with us. Like anywhere you might say it, you can you if you come the Roman Catholic missions in Africa, it's the same as the missions that you have from the Iranian missions, the Shiite Islamic Shiite or the Islamic Sunni Islam mission from the Saudi Arabians. Nobody is with us. It does not matter what form they come with or what shape they is either ideologically or religiously or politically. Africa is at the center of the events because Africa has what world needs to survive. This is why always everybody is coming. And then they must not come with one picture, they should come with different shape and forms. And this is why it varies. Because for instance, when you look at all the African universities right now, because I just recently graduated, there's no African university you will find 80% of the African women in our universities are subscribing to the ideology they call feminism. And when we talk about feminism, to our perspective, like there's nobody that could empower women more than Sankara. But
Yeah.
Sankara's feminism is not as the same as what they're telling our young girls in the universities. It's about letting go of whatever stand as an African woman to embrace what is not African, that will eventually hand over Africa to the enemies of Africa. So they come with different formats. It's either religion or ideology. So,
Yeah.
but and it is always and serving as what the military bases are serving them with. Is to hand over Africa to them in the silver plate.
Okay. Mr. Gerald, back to you. Let's slightly talk about the European Union. Do you think the European Union was quick in assisting a member who was in distress? Do you think it acted quickly in assisting, or do you think it's lagged a bit? What do you think?
In terms of the assistance to in Ukraine,
Yeah.
yeah, they responded. They did, because you see, the thing about take for example the European Union, and you look at NATO. I just want to say something. Turkey, for example, is a member of NATO because they have a very strong military. But they would not let Turkey into the European Union. And they keep Turkey out, the French and others keep Turkey out of the European Union on the grounds that they're not Europeans. You know, when I was growing up, youngster primary school, they had in the books, they used to refer to Turkey as the sick man of Europe. So they would keep Turkey, they need Turkey in the military, in NATO, which is a military alliance, but they don't want Turkey in the European Union. And that there's a number of reasons for that. It's not just because they're Turks, but the Turkish economy is very powerful. And they want, for economic reasons, they want to keep Turkey out. The way they responded to Ukraine was different.
Mhm.
And the idea is that Ukraine is always part of as linked up to the EU. It's just that Ukraine want to come under the umbrella. They want to become a member of NATO. The Russians have no problem. The Russians have no problem with Ukraine or any one of them being in the EU. The Russians have no problem with that. The problem is the military encirclement, putting missiles and weapons of mass destruction right around Russia. You have to be a fool to sit back. Putin or any Russian leader, even if it wasn't Putin, would just sit back and allow that to happen. And there's a reason for that. Because the West, they want to expand further and to go as far down, because this is an economic agenda. When you read the global chessboard and you look at what people like Brzezinski and others were planning, you see that these guys actually sat down and mapped out this thing a long time ago. And only we were not paying attention. Many of us don't pay attention to this, but these people just don't wake up one morning and decide this is what they're going to do. There's a plan. There's a plan. And Russia is aware of it. And Russia has to protect its territorial integrity and protect its sovereignty. Because at the end of the day, although the former Soviet Union is no longer in existence, there are certain things that are still intact in Russia. That are still intact. The Russians suffered more than any other country during the so-called Second World War. They lost almost 30 million people. And the Russians know what it is to fight fascism. And there's a strong national, social national character in the Russian state and a developmental state. A state that, although they allow this and private capitalism and all of that, there are certain things that the Russian state will not allow private capitalism to undo, because it has been so institutionalized and entrenched in the Russian psyche, in the Russian nation, that it's difficult to reverse. And you take, for example, when during the Soviet Union time, they had a military alliance, military cooperation with Syria. And that the Soviet Union collapsed. But Russia today, that was part of the former Soviet Union, still honor that obligation and treaty, right? Russia is not Russia is not a communist country, good, but they still have strong relations with Cuba. They came to Cuba's assistance during the pandemic. They sent with the blockade. They sent shiploads of assistance that Cuba gave. They assist Venezuela. They assist Nicaragua, and they assist other countries in this so-called U.S. backyard that the United States is bullying and threatening. So although the Soviet Union is no longer there, Russia is still playing a progressive role in the international arena, right? We saw that. Anybody who is going to, if you're faced with the threat of those groups that are ravaging the Sahel, you see them running around, attacking Malian troops. Only, I think it was last week, 18 to 32, between that 20 to 32 Malian soldiers were killed.
Yeah.
And this fight, they're even in Mozambique. They're all over. And the reality is that we need some allies. And definitely, we're not going to take the devil and make him an ally. Good? This is not a defense of Russia. This is to look and understand real politics, and not the politics in constructing the world in our head. It doesn't work like that.
Okay. Wow. We all know about Mr. Putin, right? Do you think he will go down in history as a man who saved Russia, or as a man who tainted his personal image? Just random thoughts. What do you actually think about that? Anybody can join in.
Okay, I think he will go down. I think Russians will see him as someone who saved Russia, and I think it's already showing up in this part of the world. In a couple of years, people will eventually see who the real culprits are and the role Putin played, the role Putin played at this
So
period.
he would actually go down in history as a man who saved Russia.
I think that when he took power, nobody would have thought that he would stay so long in power.
Yeah.
He had a duet with Medvedev for a while, and it was during Medvedev presidency of Russia that the case of Libya, I think, was set up, and he was not president, and Russia took a position at the UN Security Council that was not strong enough to prevent from the foreign intervention in Libya. So when the same case appeared in Syria, he understood that he could not make the same mistake. So I think that he saw that the Western are liars. They were liars. You could not rely on the words of the Western powers. You could not rely on the speech of the US president. And he understood it. So now he's really self-confident in his position. And I think that Russian intervention in Syria, in Libya, in Sudan, and so on, showed that Russia can solve some security issue in Africa. And this is what Africans are asking from Russia. When you speak with Mali, they are saying that we used to work with French to secure our country, but French did not, they did not do the job. So we need to find another partner who has a stronger military experience and power to secure our country. And Russia is using this military power. And I think that the image of Vladimir Putin is the one of a strong man. And he is also the first representative of the Russian military power in the world. So all those elements, all those points, you can say that he will stay in history, even if today there is a propaganda to say that he's a dictator, etc., etc. It does not mean that everything is perfect in Russia, but in his position, leading the second military power and the first largest country in the world, I think that what he's doing is quite interesting for the rest of the world that does not want to fall under the global US domination.
Okay, I'm trying to go through the comments of some of our viewers, and I have a question here. Don't you think African leaders should position themselves on the side of Russia? One of our viewers is asking. I think I direct that to you, Mr. Ibrahim. Yeah.
Okay.
No, go. Okay, I think it depends on the situation, on which African leaders. You have some African countries who took position with Russia, but unless Eritrea clearly took position, the others say they stay neutral or they condemn. I think neutrality had to be more strategic. And taking position for Russia is also a way to diminish the French or US domination in Africa. I think also that we have to understand that Russia is moving on the economic side in Africa. In a few months, we'll have the second Russia-Africa Forum Partnership in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So you also have economic interest. It is not only about military issue. And the position of Africans regarding the Russia-Ukraine and the Russia-Western conflict should be guided by African interests. Because I'm afraid that because we are relying on Russia to move out of the Western neo-imperialism, we fall in another dependency. So the first position is that Africans have to unite and to find a common position. This is really important, really important.
Oh, wow, great insights there. We have a question for you, Mr. Gerald. I think this was in regards to what you had earlier stated. Someone says, I'm totally in agreement with Mr. Gerald about what he said on Uganda and Rwanda in what happened in the DRC war. But he did not mention what was the situation in the region before that war. I don't know if you remember you talking about that.
The situation in the region before the war?
Yeah.
Well, what really was happening in the region was there were a number of groups that were fighting to bring down Mobutu. There were a number of guerrilla and liberation forces. You had one that was led by this late Pan-Africanist that died recently. His name is I'll remember his name just now. Anyhow,
Wamba?
Sorry?
Wamba. No, Wamba.
Sorry, what's that?
Isn't it Wamba Diawamba?
Wamba Diawamba, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And he is meant to be, he was a very progressive historian, but they found themselves, they eventually split. They were getting help from Uganda, but there were different groups, there were different organizations, and they were each trying to hold the territory and so. But Kabila was able to bring together a number of groups, and with the backing of Rwanda and Uganda, they were able to successfully march into the capital, into Kinshasa, and so on. Mobutu fled. But then a lot of things start developing, and so because one of the things that happened was that some of the Hutu rebel groups that were based in Rwanda after Paul Kagame came into power, some of the Hutu rebel groups that were operating in Rwanda fled into the Democratic Republic of Congo and were carrying out attacking Rwanda from there. So Rwanda always used that as a pretext, as a reason for being present to neutralize them, for being present so that they can be present, they can keep their troops in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But of course, no one, you will have to be really foolish to deny that and I'm convinced, I am one who buy into that, I believe that the leadership, the presidency in Rwanda and Uganda were involved at some level or know about what transpired and with the removal of Kabila.
Yeah.
Right? No one can deny that. And it was interesting. The day when Kabila was killed, there was a statement made by the U.S. State Department, and Colin Powell came out and he spoke. And anyone reading Colin Powell's statement would know that the Americans have given their blessing to that. And I will argue, because somebody raised the issue of fake Pan-Africanists, and I said, I do not believe that the president and the leadership of Uganda are committed to united at a Pan-African project. I do not believe Rwanda, they're Pan-Africanists. I do not believe that the ANC is a Pan-Africanist organization. I believe that the EFF under Julius Malema is a Pan-African organization. I believe Robert Sobukwe's Pan-African Congress is a Pan-African organization. And we have to, the brother said, we have to, at the end of the day, we have to build what Nkrumah mentioned in his book on guerrilla warfare, and he spoke about the handbook of guerrilla warfare. We need a Pan-African, an all-African People's Revolutionary Army that will intervene in areas will intervene in areas to protect Africans and protect African sovereignty. But we cannot, we will never get an all-African People's Revolutionary Army the way Nkrumah conceptualized it with the neo-colonial regimes we have in Africa. Because the neo-colonial regimes are not committed to the transformation of Africa. They're not. They're happy to be mere managers to manage the neo-colonial system. And all the parties that compete, with the exception of the revolutionary-oriented one, is to manage the neoliberal project in Africa for the imperial powers, to show who is better at managing on behalf of imperialism. And that's what they do. You look at it, we have lost the days of Nkrumah, gone. Sekou Touré, Modibo Keïta, and then we threw up the Murtala Mohammeds, they killed him. Thomas Sankara, they did the same. They did it with Lumumba. They got rid of Mariam Ngouabi and all of those people. They killed African leaders like Mehdi Ben Barka in Morocco. And they did it to Muammar Gaddafi because he was sitting on 160 tons of silver and 150 tons of gold to implement the gold dinar. They were setting up a bank off Venezuela, the coast, in Margarita to assist Caribbean development and African organizations, all of that. You really think the French and the imperial powers wanted that? They're not interested. That's what they do. So we got to call out these fake Pan-Africanists. They're not. Over the years, what have they achieved? What have they done? They're holding on to neoliberal economic policies, whether it's in Ghana, South Africa. We dismantled apartheid. Apartheid is still, you have economic apartheid. White monopoly capital is still powerful in South Africa after so many years of ANC rule. And Africans are still waiting on them to deliver. The masses are still waiting for real and meaningful change. Change that could touch their lives at the bottom: housing, healthcare, free education, fees must fall. And that's why at every elections, every general elections, the EFF keeps gaining and the ANC support base is declining.
Wow. Thank you very much, Mr. Gerald, for that question. Our viewers, I believe you were answered. If you have more questions, keep going on the comments. We all know about coup d'etat. How do you think we would be able to prevent coup d'etat? Mr. Amzat, if you could go first.
Yeah, coup d'etat is a French word, so it's part of the French political vision of taking power. It is based on the French system of putting power in the hands of one man, one family, one group. And if you want to take power, you need to overthrow this man or this family or this group. Coup d'etat is also interesting because it is linked to the militarization of politics and economics. Military spending or rising to prevent from coup d'etat by regime that need to keep the military power in the hands to maintain in power. So we have a vicious circle, and people are trying to get free, because I think that the liberation will not come from one man, but it will come from the people. So coup d'etat is also interesting because you have conservative and reactionary coup d'etat, and you have progressive coup d'etat. For example, Thomas Sankara, it's a progressive, Pan-Africanist and revolutionary coup d'etat. So in the case of Mali today, for example, we have Assimi Goïta with Choguel Maïga as prime minister, and many people think that it is a progressive coup d'etat because it is putting Mali out of the clutches of France, and it also put Mali at the center of African solidarity. And this coup d'etat is the fourth or fifth in the last years in Mali, because you have a succession of coup d'etat. So you need to break the neo-colonial system. You need to break it by any means necessary, like Malcolm X would say. But in the meantime, you have to get an ideological vision of where do you want to go when you take power. So we are not in the condemnation of any kind of coup d'etat. Like the West, every time there is a coup d'etat in Africa, they are saying, oh, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. But there are very few positive coup d'etat. Because we have also constitutional coup d'etat, some presidents that want to stay in power illegally, and they maintain in power. And when they stay in power illegally, generally they are supported by France. It's the case of Alassane Ouattara in Ivory Coast, of Eyadema Fauré in Togo, and so on. So coup d'etat is part of the political landscape of Africa. And even if the African Union is condemning powers, the people that take powers with a coup d'etat, we can see a new definition of a coup d'etat. And this is part of the new generation of African putschists that are taking power today. If you look at Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, all those military who took power, they are almost 40 years old. And most of them, and the three of them, have been trained in the special forces, the Western and sometimes also Russian special forces. And they were trained in governance. So we have a new kind of coup d'etat today that is really interesting to study, because it is not coming from the general military system, it's coming from the special forces. So it is a new generation of coup d'etat, and I think that in the next years, there will be more and more coup d'etat in Africa if we could not build a strong people's participation political system. So political parties have to make their aggiornamento. We need to build people's revolutionary Pan-Africanist political parties. And this is what we are trying to do with the Pan-African League Umoja. We are trying to implement some Pan-African links, a transnational vision between the different countries, so that the dynamics, the positive dynamics of one country could also move out of this country. And coup d'etat, I think, are just tools that can be used to move out of this statu quo, this neo-colonial statu quo. But sometimes you fall in another statu quo.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thank you. Anybody who would like to add on that before I wrap up that?
I must congratulate my brother Amzat on that. I agree with him, everything he said. Congratulations.
There's a point I'd like to add, and as I mentioned in our last session on the Pan-African History Month, is that coup d'etats, as they've been introduced to the post-colonial Africa to distract the African independent liberation, or to stop the momentum that the African independent liberation struggle gained throughout the continent. If we have to repeat the coup d'etats that were done by the likes of Thomas Sankara 1 billion times in Africa, we shall do them again.
Okay.
Because they were the inspirations of the people. These were at the time when people have been imposed upon leaders that are at nowhere serving the interests of the people that they claim to be governing. So as a result, you have people like Thomas Sankara coming to power to serve the interest of the people. And if Africa has the opportunity to repeat it 1 billion times, we will do it again, just to make sure that the liberation of the continent moves on, because each and every people have to go through a certain difficult time. They must make difficult choices. And those were one of the choices that we made, and they worked for us. And then we never regretted them, and then we refused to see them like the rest of the coup d'etats. When we discuss about coup d'etats that are not being for the people cannot be the coup d'etats, the revolution of the people. And then there must always be distinction to distinguish the two. Because once you discuss it all, the coup d'etats are bad in Africa. And then we have a question in our mind. Power coup d'etat, was it the same as Blaise Compaoré? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
Yes.
Of course, we have to support. I agree with both brothers. We have to support progressive and revolutionary coups that would bring. We had them. We had coups like with Thomas Sankara, Murtala Mohammed in Nigeria, Muammar Gaddafi when they carried out the coup. Those are progressive coups that were aimed at uplifting the people and using the country's resources to improve people's standard of living and well-being. Those are the coups we support. But we also have to be very careful with the way the Europeans are they're such great deceivers, the way they use, when they speak coups, when you hear the word coup right away, you think about Africa. But they have coups. You look at you look in Britain and you see how the conservative parties carry out the little palace coups and remove their leaders or ministers, former prime ministers, and then implement. They have coups too. But we don't call that. You see the way how they construct everything at the mentally ideological level. So when you hear coups or when they refer to African leaders, you refer to them as strong men, strong man, Zimbabwe strong men. But you don't use that term when you apply it to Western leaders. Good? Warlords. They use the term warlords. That's for African leaders. They use those terms. We don't have the Western countries that have a history of wars and invasions of other people's country. They are not referred to as warlords. They're defenders of human rights, democracy, and all of these terms that they use really to maintain their domination or to implement regime change in countries that they're opposed to those governments.
Okay, I believe we are almost coming to the end of our discussion. And this brings me to a question. We are in the social media world. We're in a world where social media is taking over. I believe online, especially ever since COVID hit, like online is simply taking over. And with the war ongoing, and of course with the ongoing peace talks, we have pictures and videos which are circulating on social media. Some are deemed as fake, some are deemed as altered. And do you think this affects the ongoing peace talks? And how are we actually able to verify like what's real and what's not real, if we're actually able to? The floor is open as we wrap up.
I think social media is part of the propaganda war, and I think that there are lots of noise to hide what is really important. So I don't think that, globally speaking, we should trust social media and everything that is on the web. I think that we need to move back to the old school style that is working with people on the grounds, working with people that are based where things happens. And this is really important because important decisions in this world are not taken on social media. They are taken in places where people have to leave their mobile out. And I think that social media is also a screen of disinformation in many cases. In the case of Africa, you have to remind that it was Barack Obama who decided to expand Facebook, Twitter, Instagram in Africa in 2010, just before what was called the Arab Spring, to develop some cyber activism that were aligned on some imperialist discourse. So sometimes someone raised the question about Radio France International, the French media, and so on. We could also speak of Russia today. So we have a propaganda war today. And I think that we need to be very careful about what we see on the screen, what we hear, because everyone knew that there was a false a false murder attributed to Gaddafi, saying that he was killing his people, and we know that it was absolutely false. And these things was put on the media to justify the foreign intervention. So we have to be really, really careful about social media. And I think that we need to base our works on the grounds, so with people that are on the grounds. And yeah.
Okay. Mr. Ibrahim?
Yes, can my professor go first? Because I always want to hear from him.
Okay, I'm the last person that could ever be any expert on social media, and I'm happy we have people like Sister Odawa and those who are up on it, and that they can, make a tremendous contribution into getting the truth out there. But as my brother Amzat said, this is an info war we're fighting, and we got to fight to win this war. When they started what happened in Libya, they made a proper background of Green Square, and that was made by Al Jazeera for Al Jazeera in Qatar. And they were showing pictures that had nothing to do with those crowds in Libya. It's amazing. And it happened recently with Cuba. There was some number of protesters in Cuba, and they were actually caught. They were using the social media experts, the progressive guys were able to see. They were using pictures from demonstrations in Argentina against the Argentine government at the time, austerity policies, and were doing it in such a way to show that it was in Cuba. But one of them made a mistake, and I think what they did with the statue or of one of the heroes, they didn't remove it, and the whole thing was blown. But people saw what was happening, and this is what they're doing. And when they had what was happening in Ethiopia, in that war in Ethiopia, Ethiopians all over Western capitals were coming out and marching and referring to ban. They're saying, calling CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera liars, because they realized what was happening and that this was a replay of what took place in Libya, and they do that. They take these things, the fake news, and they throw it out there. And we have to be careful, because many people, we see it coming out there and many fall for it. And they're good. As I said, I don't know. Sometimes you get the fake things coming out, but I'm able to pick up some of them, but it's an info war, and we have to be very careful, and we have to fight. We have to make our contribution. This is a war that we have to win.
Wow. Okay. So I think we've had a very...
Yeah, I said one method one might use, for someone might use to be able to be in a safe side in this war of information, is to, if somebody publish something, what is it that they don't want me to understand? That's what I look for. Like whenever somebody posted something, like I should understand the opposite of what they want me to understand. And this always helps somebody, because you can't go for what they want you to see. Like, for instance, when you see an African calling Gaddafi a dictator, and then not knowing in Libya, one might graduate from university and decided not to be working and still be paid half of the wages that they need to be paid.
That's right.
Like, you call that leader a dictator, where when the sovereign wealth is divided among the people of the country, without even them asking it, they just still receiving notifications in their bank account that so and so thousands of dollars have been deposited in your account. But an African sitting in an African country, because BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera said Gaddafi is killing 2,000 of his people, and then you call him a dictator. I say, whenever something is published, you should understand from the publisher what they don't want you to understand. And then with that, you not become a victim of the misinformation that is going on.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this discussion. Remember, everybody, what we're talking about today is the Western military intervention in Africa and the Sahel region. Other than that, of course, we were talking about the NATO expansion and the new age of imperialism. We've had a very interesting conversation, and in 30 seconds, I'd like our panelists to give their final remarks, beginning with you, Mr. Gerald.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Brother Daniel and the United States of Africa and the other related organizations for this program, and to congratulate you, Sister Moore, for the job you just did. And we need more sessions like this so we can discuss what is taking place on the motherland and the diaspora. You know, we need to bring together representatives and activists from various organizations so that we can share our ideas and experiences, find common ground in our struggle for true independence and total emancipation of our peoples. And this forum plays such a role, a very meaningful and emancipatory role.
Okay, thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us as well, Mr. Ibrahim.
Yeah, so I would like to thank everybody, especially the leadership at GPAN Global Pan-Africanism Network, and also all the people that have been participating throughout the African History Month. And as I said, this is a wind that started blowing and nobody can stop. There's a momentum of passion for Pan-Africanism and the liberation struggle that is coming to the Africa after being so long been defeated, when most of our leaders have been taken down. And there's nobody that can stop it. And it's either to be part of the struggle to liberate us from Johannesburg to Banjul, from Qatar, from Cairo to last city in the Western Africa. Because today we are willing to learn Yoruba, Hausa, Swahili, Mandinka, Wolof, just to be able to communicate to one another. And then this started, and there's nobody that can stop it. And if there's any platform one can praise for doing that, among many, is this platform that we are in today. And special thanks to Daniel and all the leadership and all the people that have been working in the background to make sure that these finest people of these great two personalities I am blessed with in the same forum with today. And also my sister Odoa from Nairobi. You know, I would say like Asante Sanaban and Mifrai Sanaban. So like we all okay, and then this is it. We must be influencing the people around us, and then to keep the hopes alive that this can be done, and it must be done in this generation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And finally, Dr. Amzat, your final remarks.
Yes, I would like to thank the Global Pan-Africanism Network for the organization of this event, of this African History Month. It was a pleasure to be part of two panels and to exchange with brothers and sisters who share this Pan-African agenda, who understand that we need to expand our network, that we need to address some strategic issues to revive revolutionary Pan-Africanism, and also to defeat neocolonialism and self-despisement of our own. This is really important, that we understand that we can do it. We can take the continuation of our ancestors, and we need to overcome the tension that the world is facing today. And the only way we can do it is by building a strong Pan-Africanist and revolutionary agenda. And for this, all our organizations need to join need to support one another. So this moment, this event is an occasion to forge some links. And I thank you for the organization of the debates. I thank you, Gerald and Ibrahima, for the stimulating exchanges, and all the people who are with us for the task of liberating Africa and building a Pan-African revolutionary movement. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much. And of course, special thanks to the founder of the African History Month, Mr. Daniel Mombonu. Remember, the African History Month is an annual event where we celebrate the achievements of the people of the African descent and, of course, their enormous contribution to the world's civilization. It has been a pleasure on the final episode of the month of March, and we look forward to greater conversations the next coming months and, of course, the rest of the year. We look forward to coming together, sharing ideas, and exploring our thoughts. Special thanks to you, our panelists, for making time, your contribution, engaging with our viewers, and sharing with us your thoughts and, of course, your contributions. We will not take it for granted. And thank you, our viewers, our sponsors, our partners. We appreciate you all. Until next time, we say goodbye. In Nairobi, Kenya, we say kwaheri, asanteni sana. Good.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm.